n'y a pas de problème. D'accord. Merci. Oui.
I'll sit down, shall I?
Bon. Alors, bienvenue, chers collègues, chers amis, chers étudiants, étudiantes. Je suis Jean-François Desbiens, je suis directeur de l'antenne sherbrookoise du Centre de recherche interuniversitaire sur la formation et la profession enseignante. Et je vous souhaite la plus cordiale des bienvenues à cette conférence qui nous sera livrée par le professeur Barrie Gordon de la Victoria University à Wellington, en Nouvelle-Zélande. Donc, la conférence qui est retransmise par vidéoconférence, mais vous aurez deviné que la retransmission est actuellement en difficulté. Donc, nos collègues et amis des autres composantes nous attraperont en vol, comme on dit par chez nous. Donc, cette conférence-là sera structurée de la façon suivante. Là, le professeur Gordon a prévu entre 30 et 40 minutes de présentation. Suivront les questions de la part de l'auditoire et je souhaite qu'il y en ait de nombreuses. Je ne doute pas qu'elles seront bonnes. Et peut-être y aura-t-il, si on est chanceux, des questions de la part des collègues des autres constituantes si effectivement on réussit à bien se connecter. Alors, sans plus tarder, j'aimerais passer la parole à ma collègue Sylvie Baudouin qui va nous présenter le conférencier. Alors, bonne conférence. Je suis persuadé que nous allons apprendre des choses extrêmement judicieuses pour notre domaine, l'éducation physique et l'intervention en éducation physique. Merci. Professeur Gordon.
Donc, bonjour à tous. Merci d'être présents ici à l'Agora à Sherbrooke et merci aux gens qui se joignent à nous par visioconférence. Je tiens à remercier premièrement le CRIFPE Sherbrooke et la maison mère du CRIFPE également pour permettre cette conférence. Nous avons l'immense honneur ici à Sherbrooke de recevoir le professeur Barrie Gordon. Comme Jean-François l'a dit, le professeur Gordon vient de loin, il travaille en Nouvelle-Zélande. C'est un professeur-chercheur à l'Université Victoria qui est basée à Wellington. Le professeur Gordon profite présentement d'un Fulbright avec des gens de la Northern Illinois University à Chicago. Donc, il est ici pour une période de 3 mois et c'est sa seule visite au Canada. Donc, nous sommes extrêmement privilégiés de l'avoir parmi nous là, pour ces quelques jours. Avant d'être chercheur-professeur, le professeur Gordon a été également professeur d'éducation physique. Donc, c'est un éducateur physique au secondaire. Il l'a été pendant près d'une vingtaine d'années au secondaire. Et son intérêt de recherche le plus particulier, c'est l'enseignement de la responsabilité personnelle et sociale, notamment par l'activité physique, par la pratique de l'activité physique. Et c'est un intérêt de recherche que nous partageons les deux. Nous faisons notamment partie de la TPSR Alliance, qui regroupe une quarantaine de chercheurs au niveau international. Donc, nous travaillons ensemble à développer cet objet de recherche-là. Et donc, c'est basé dans plusieurs pays, puis on a des collaborations qui se développent, notamment le professeur Gordon va être responsable d'un séminaire qui va avoir lieu à Auckland, en Nouvelle-Zélande, en février. Et nous allons notamment parler du développement professionnel en lien avec l'enseignement de la responsabilité personnelle et sociale. Donc, sans plus tarder, je vais laisser la parole au professeur Gordon et je vous souhaite une excellente conférence et je ne doute point que nous allons avoir un très bon moment avec lui.
Oh, thank you. Merci. Bonjour, bonjour. That is it, as far as my French is concerned, except for one word that I learned last night at the ice hockey. Bourgeois. No? Bagarre. Fire. It was an interesting evening to go to the ice hockey, and it sort of relates a little bit to here because my wife at the back there, Shona, and I went, and it was our first ice hockey game. And it was really a fascinating game, a fantastic game. I could see myself loving to play it. But when the fights happened, I was so interested in the response of the audience. And I was talking to Sylvie before, and I watched a man who was probably in his 50s, you know, looked like a normal man, just on his feet going nuts because a guy had punched out another player. Oops, is that gone? And I thought, and I was just thinking then, how do we socialise our kids? These are 16 and 18-year-old boys, and yet it was acceptable in that context, and yet we say that we wouldn't allow it to happen in a supermarket, anywhere else, but something about sport allows those sort of behaviours. And so, you know, I always start by saying that sport and physical activity are a context that can be really, really powerful, for good or for bad, really. And it's not, the context by itself is not a positive one, it is what happens in it. And that relates a lot to the work that Sylvie and I do around using those sort of contexts for teaching personal and social responsibility. So I'll quickly go what I thought today, and I understand from Sylvie that a lot of people here don't actually don't know the TPSR model itself. So I thought I'd start with just an introduction, and it will be very much an introduction. Look at the relationship to the New Zealand curriculum, because we have a different curriculum, of course, and it relates quite well to that. Explore some research projects that we've completed in New Zealand. And then also look at it as a model of pedagogical approach that could be used in other areas of teaching, other learning areas as we call them, and even across schools, which has happened, and then looking at the future directions for this particular model and any questions that are there. If you do have questions that arise during the time, please just ask them. I'd much rather have that, because I know that often you have a question and then by the end of it, you've forgotten it or it's moved on. So I'm more than happy if you give me the nod in there. Okay, so what is TPSR, Teaching Personal and Social Responsibility? The first thing is that it's based around positive youth development. It's not a remedial program. It's not a fix-it for kids who are doing things wrong. But it believes strongly that most, if not all, kids have got positive attributes which we can develop. Okay, we can build on those attributes through TPSR through a variety of different ways, but then this is one particular way. And I started with talking about the ice hockey last night, and thinking that, you know, sport and physical activity, physical education, physical programs are really, really good contexts for developing positive development, socialisation. Okay, they are the hook for many kids, and you know, lots of kids like to be involved in those programs. If you want to develop further than simply the practical, the physical skills and the knowledge of the game, etc., and you really want to develop socialisation out of it, then this model believes that it has to be done quite explicitly and that it won't just happen. So our Prime Minister has just given, in New Zealand terms, when we've only got 4 million people, something like $128 million to programs for sports in school. And he announced this and said, sport has been shown to be really good for character development. Therefore, we're pumping all this money into it. And, you know, yes and no. If $128 2 million went into ice hockey, and they developed the sort of things we were watching last night, then you would have to say that's pretty marginal. Okay, so it doesn't happen by osmosis. It has to be actually explicitly taught and worked. Okay, those are the 4 major themes, and I won't go over them in great detail. But if you're teaching with TPSR, then those 4 themes have to be integrated throughout. Okay, and if you're thinking of teachers, and most of my work is in schools and physical education. I'm here because Sylvie's work is with the higher education, and so it's a nice interest to me. That's something quite different. That's how come I'm here in Sherbrooke, learning French. The first is that there's a certain sort of relationship that needs to be developed. And later when I talked about my research and one of the research projects, if that relationship isn't there, then this sort of personal and social responsibility won't happen. So if you're a sort of dominant teacher, autocratic, top-down, then you can't really teach this, successfully use this model. You need to actually have a certain sort of relationship. The second one is one that physical education teachers find quite difficult, and that is that you need an integration of what you're trying to teach around personal and social responsibility with the pedagogical approaches you use. And Don Hallison, who I'll talk later about, who developed the model originally, he said, you know, we spend so much of our time complaining that young kids make bad choices, but we never give them a chance to make choices and then take the consequences of them in secure ways. And so, for example, in this model, you would give kids lots of choices, legitimate choices. And that comes into the 4th one, the empowerment of students, choices and voices, as they say. And so the children, the students, the higher education possibly, I'm not sure, the people you're working with are given a lot of power within the context you're working in. Now, if you think about, I'm not sure how it is here in your schools, but certainly in New Zealand schools, sometimes that's a challenge for teachers. Okay? And then the last one is that what we teach in the classroom, the club after school, whatever, isn't just left in that classroom, because it's important that it's transferred out into the kids' lives in other areas. Okay? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Within the model, there's 5 goals or levels, as they call them. Respect is more about getting, in the situation of a school, the kids being respectful enough to allow you to teach and the kids to learn. Now, that's quite a big jump. I'm sure you have those kids in your schools that are misbehaving, disruptive, cause problems. I can see a lot of nodding. Okay, the sort of kid who influences the whole class and makes it difficult. And if that kid can move to a point where they'll come and sit quietly in the corner and not participate perhaps, but actually allow you to teach, then that actually is an achievement for that kid. And this particular model allows you to say, that's great, you've done this, how can we help you move on? Okay, and I've seen that a number of times where it really is an effort for a kid not to deliberately disrupt a class. And so you have, this allows you to reward them for that. Effort is being involved, trying to get the kids in effort. Self-directed learning, the way the pedagogical approaches, again, we try and develop it so that they can take responsibility for their own learning. Care, that's the social interaction, trying to get the kids to be able to have empathy, work with other kids, help them without needing it. And again, transfer, that whole idea that what we're learning in the classroom, wherever, is applicable in other classrooms, applicable in their home life, applicable if they're working in the secondary school level. Okay, so very quickly, that's the sort of goals that we talk about, the sort of levels that we talk about. And for those who do know, and I know there's a couple here for TPSR, one of the discussions I often have is whether it should be goals or levels, hierarchical levels. And my belief is strongly that it should be goals. But that's another story. Okay, and then just quickly, the transfer is so important. Because when we talk about the research later, having well-behaved kids who are caring, empathetic, working nicely in the classroom, who then go outside and break into cars and get into fights, makes it nice for the teacher. But it's not the intent of this model. The intent of this model is to impact on the kids' lives after they leave the school, leave the classroom or leave wherever you are. Major reason for the project, for the program. when we look at the research in a minute, transfer is often ignored by teachers. Now, I'm not sure about higher education, etc., but in my research, the teachers are just so happy to have a classroom that's nice, the kids are reacting nicely, they're getting really good learning going on, if it happens to be transferred, I even talk about it, and it's sort of nice extra if it happens. But the intent of the model has always been that that's the major driver of the model, and that sort of disjoint is incongruence is an interesting one that's happened that we've discovered a lot in teaching. Okay, and again, I apologise at one level in that my research is all in schools. When we start talking about this with teachers, the first thing they say is, "Oh, but I've got no time." Do you have crowded curriculums here? Do they talk about crowded curriculums? Too much? Is there too much to teach? Not enough time? Is that what your schools say? Yeah. Same with ours. And so they say we don't want to bring on this all this extra stuff around TPSR because it will stop us teaching our physical education. Okay? The reality is that we're looking at two goals. We're looking at the same goals for physical education and the twin goals for personal and social responsibility. And the research that we've done is quite extensive and shows quite clearly that because the classes are working so much better, the learning around teaching of the physical education curriculum is actually improved. Okay, so they're not losing anything, they are gaining it. And that's a really important point. I'm reminded of this because I went, and sorry, what was the school I went to today? Did you hear that? Because I can't say it. And they introduced a really interesting 20-minute physical activity period every day. And people have been working with it, and I was very impressed. Really was. But in discussion with the teacher, she was very clear that the first thing that they notice is the academic work improves. Because initially, do we take 20 minutes out to do this physical activity stuff? Because it's taking away from our numeracy, literacy, whatever. But they were very, very clear that the physical activity program had improved the academic learning for these kids. And so too with this. The introduction of the TPSR model improves the classrooms, and then you have actually improved the learning in the academic areas. Just quickly, those are some of the countries that are involved. Canada is right up there with Sylvie. I know that you're moving it on slowly, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name again. Seta here is doing his master's in the area, so it's building. And Sylvie particularly has been publishing quite a lot on it. But you can see that it's developing an international reputation. Okay? Oh, very quickly, Don Hellison is the man who, he was a Marine, I'm trying to think of, a Marine sergeant who left the Marines and went into teaching. And found it very difficult because he no longer had that positional power of being a sergeant. And these kids just looked at him and told him, whatever American kids tell sergeants who think they can yell at them. And so he developed this model over a number of years out of his own practice, very much bottom up. He came to New Zealand, did a whole lot of conferences, then he came and did some work with us. And so what happened was that now we're in a stage in New Zealand where every college of education teaches TPSR. I need a bigger ear. Teaches TPSR as a pedagogical model. So every secondary school teacher in New Zealand who's been trained in the last 10 years will know about the model. Now, they may not implement it or not. They may choose not to, but they at least know about it. So in a country of 4 million people, we've got that momentum building. And I think it's, that's the advantage of being a small country. We have a national curriculum that supports TPSR, which is really very unusual. So in the national curriculum, there's 8 learning areas. There's numeracy, literacy, etc., etc. And underpinning all of those 8, oh no, I pushed the wrong button. What do I do here, somebody? Underpinning all of those 8 learning areas are these competencies. Okay, so it is expected that if you're teaching maths, if you're teaching social sciences, whatever, that you will be aware of trying to teach in such a way that they develop thinking skills, managing themselves, relating to others, etc., etc. Now, if you're thinking of TPSR and you go back to those goals and levels, particularly the middle three are just an easy slot. It just fits in easily. Okay, and then when we go to the physical education curriculum, they have an essence statement, which is a very short statement that identifies what the essence of the learning area is. And if you read that, that's the section of that statement, you can see that they've actually identified a sense of personal and social responsibility. Okay? Contribute to the well-being of others, etc. So it's a very unusual situation where a national curriculum will identify a particular pedagogical approach and put it into the document. And so that, I mean, I feel sorry for Sylvie battling with her, you know, like a new idea with schools. For me, I simply just open up the document and say, well, here's a way to meet your requirements in the essence statement, meet your 5 competencies, etc. Okay? And what's happened for some of the teachers who have, is there some reason this is falling off? Is it working? Can you hear? Some of the very young teachers who have, I've worked with who, yeah, it might be better. We'll try not to get a, so I need to turn this off? Yep. Yep, she's off. Oh, that's right, we'll put out there and we'll.
It's okay.
That was easy. Some of the very young teachers who have ended up taking TPSR have been asked to move into a role of mentoring the wider schools around how they can meet the competencies, because they are actually doing it in their practice, and you find a science teacher who has no idea how to develop the ability for kids to manage themselves going to the PE teachers. And it's been a very, very interesting process. And one of my major problems, quite seriously, is that some of the teachers I work with get into TPSR, they start teaching, they're noticed, and they leave the school because they get, one has gone into the army to be in charge of a huge program of developing learning. Another one's been promoted out of the classroom very quickly because she's so good in the classroom. I presume that happens here in Canada as well. And so one of our problems is that we lose the TPSR teachers because they do such a good job of teaching, which is a bit of a strange situation, but the reality for us. Okay, so we've got 3 research projects I want to quickly go and have a look at. The first is a national survey of New Zealand schools. The second one was my PhD, which was a 6-month implementation, which we'll look at, a quasi-experimental one. And then I interviewed a whole lot of experienced teachers of TPSR. So there's 12 people, and they'd all used TPSR for more than 2 years in their classroom. The first national survey was to establish those 3 points. Okay, it was a survey as a survey, so of course there are limitations in a survey, but it was good to get to do. And you can see that we're not a huge country. 370 high schools. Okay, so I don't know how many you have in Quebec or Canada, but I would hazard a guess it's a lot more than 370. We got 40% response. 69 of the schools who responded said they didn't teach, and 79 schools that they taught TPSR. Okay, so 79 schools at least in New Zealand are teaching using TPSR in their normal everyday practice. Not surprisingly, those who didn't use it either hadn't heard of it or weren't confident. Okay, and the ones that hadn't heard of it were a very small number. And they were basically private schools or schools where they'd hired people who weren't necessarily trained in New Zealand. There's some there. Okay, now, I don't normally talk to you the slides, but if you look at the bottom one there, 69, almost 70% of those who responded that they were teaching using TPSR had been doing it for more than 2 years, and 38% had been using it for over 5 years. And that's a really, really important result, because if you're looking at teacher-tested programs, teachers will not continue to do something because someone at College of Education said that was worthwhile. They will only continue to do it if it works for them in their practice. And to have 70% of them have taught using TPSR for 2 years and still doing it, almost 40% over 5 years, was a really strong indication that this is a model that you can use in your classroom practice. There were some concerns. They could choose more than one, but you can see here that almost 38, half of them were only using a few individual lessons or units of up to 1 month. There were others using it for a term or a half a year and a full year. And so if you look at that 50%, you have to ask this question. Okay, and again, this is a central question. Can we expect kids to internalize the sort of development of personal and social responsibility we want if you're doing a couple of classes or a unit of a month? You know, or do we need more time? Can you expect it in that time? Oops, sorry. And that was one of the indications when we talked of transfer later on, that they weren't bothering with transfer, they weren't concerned with transfer. Again, it seemed to me that some teachers were simply going a little bit through the process and maybe not reaching the full potential. Within the structure of a lesson, and I'm only putting this up because of the next slide, the general sort of idea is that you have 5 stages. You have a relationship building time when you take time to work with the kids as they're getting organised. An awareness talk, so at the start of a lesson you will actually refocus them on what you're doing around personal and social responsibility. Could be 30 seconds, could be a couple of minutes. The activity time, which is done in a way that will actually help the kids to learn TPSR. Then at the end you have a group discussion where you discuss what happened in the classroom, and you give the kids time to reflect on their own personal behaviour in the class. And that is also a time when the opportunity is there to get them to reflect on their behaviour out of class in, say, in relation to personal and social responsibility. And that's what we got back from the numbers of teachers who said that they never or only occasionally did the following. And so again you have to say, well, are you really doing TPSR if you never allow them to reflect? You never give them a chance for a group meeting at the end to discuss what's happened in the classroom. You don't have an awareness talk. So some of the teachers appeared to be saying they were teaching this model but weren't really. There were a number of beliefs, just on a 0 to 9 Likert scale, things like has a positive impact on student behaviour. You have to excuse the RM at the bottom. That was, when I did this originally, it was a responsibility model, but it's now changed. And you can see that they highly regarded that it had a positive impact on student behaviour on the left-hand side, that it increased the student learning in physical education, that the students were more supportive, that they were able to use self-directed learning, and that there were positive outcomes in other areas. Now this is a survey, it's teachers' perceptions, it's what they think has happened from the model. Okay, but you can see that it's on a 0 to 9, it's reasonably high, up over the 7s, most of them, and quite a few up onto 9. Absolutely certain of these things. The second one was my PhD, and this was interesting in that there were 4 classes. 2 were taught by traditional pedagogy and 2 by TPSR, and all 4 were taught by one young second-year teacher. Okay, so she actually taught all 4 classes, and one of the difficulties was that as the good things happened with TPSR, then she tried to slide those into the traditional pedagogy. So there was a little bit of a battle at times. This is what we found. It was quasi-experimental in effect, which was as close as we got. The classes were positive, supportive, well behaved, and that's consistent across virtually all of the research on this model. The majority of the students were able to talk better about what personal and social responsibility was. They engaged in the curriculum at much a higher level, and they demonstrated personal and social responsibility in the classroom really well. And it was very, very obvious as an observer. She chose the 2 worst classes, and they were pretty tough classes for New Zealand-wide. By the end of it, they were immaculate. They were unbelievably good in phys ed. However, 2 things. One, they showed little knowledge of it being a transfer, and the last point there was they caused chaos in the school. So you've got 2 classes here who are really tough classes, and they are, within physical education, are perfect. So they were given choices, they were responsible for their programs, they went into the science or whatever, and the teacher told them, sit down, be quiet, and they reacted really, really badly. So they contrasted what was happening in PE to the other teachers, didn't like it, couldn't transfer the fact that they had responsibilities, and I walked into one day and the teacher was in tears. The deans had called a special meeting of all the other teachers of these classes, and basically they ambushed her and said, you know, what have you done? You've ruined all our classes. And so it was an interesting thing that you have to be aware that you need to talk early on with the students and say that it will be different to other classes, but you need to be responsible in those other classes. That was an interesting outcome. It's also probably a good idea. We often get the teachers to talk to the other teachers about what they're doing. I also did a series of interviews, 2 years or more with these. Every one of them said they will continue using TPSR into the future, as far as they could see. They all believed strongly that it improved the relationships within the class and the student behaviour, but they once again had very limited commitment to it transferring into the kids' lives. Okay, it was very much a nice extra if it happens. When I was interviewing and after we had started digging deeper and deeper and deeper, there was a wide variety of ways that the TPSR was taught in practice. And there's a guy called Guy Claxton has a saying about, is this showing flexibility, or have you developed what he calls a toxic mutation? And in fairness, I would say that some of the variations would be toxic mutations. They would say, yes, I've been doing TPSR, etc., but it was really more to do with concentration on behaviour and an overview of almost like a punitive, you're not reaching the right levels, you're a level 0 type action, rather than giving them opportunities within the way they taught. There was only some. This lady here, the most sophisticated, blew my socks off. She has taken this model to places that I would be too frightened to go to. And the result is that she's been given every tough class in the school, and she's been asked to run programs all over the city. I could talk all day, but the one thing that really amazed me was that, well, the 2 things. The firstly is that she has got to the point, she takes them a whole year, and the last term, she hands them the curriculum that they're meant to teach. She's meant to teach for that last term, and the kids are given full responsibility for how that's going to be taught. So whatever they're doing, if they're doing, I don't know, basketball, she says, okay, so we've got 5 weeks of basketball, 10 lessons, tell me how you want me to teach you, how you want to learn basketball. And they organise it. And this is tough classes. This is she gets the classes that no one really wants. So it's just brilliant. I was so amazed by her. Again, though, she was, as a young teacher, was teaching a class, and the principal came into the gym and sat there for a whole period. And of course, as a young teacher, she was petrified. She went, the principal said, I want to see you after this. So she went nervously there, and the principal was a science-based teacher originally, so she was combining teaching with another science teacher, because this class was so badly behaved, neither of them could control them. She came into the gym to take a couple of these kids out of the class and sat there and couldn't believe it was the same class. And she said to Jenny, you won't know her anyway, Jenny, this is not the same class, what are you doing? And so within a very short time, she was on the phone to me and saying, oh my God, I've got to do a full staff meeting around it. But the principal asked her to do a full staff meeting on student behaviour.
And she refused. I mean, it was pretty gutsy for third-year teacher, and said, I will do a workshop on developing relationships and empowering students, but I won't do one on student behaviour, because that's all the teachers saw. So it was really interesting. So she's out of teaching also now. She's doing some other work once she got there. Okay, so is TPSR a physical education sport-based program, or can it be worked across other areas? Okay. The principles of empowerment, the principles of integrating the way your pedagogical approaches, etc., all those themes go across quite easily. I'm not sure who teaches what here, but if you're a science teacher, I think that you could do any of those things. Almost every time, the want to drive across to other subjects is driven by student behaviour, because the kids behave so much better, their relationship is so much better, the classroom is so much nicer, that's what drives the thought, I'm going to grab hold of whatever they're doing in PE and do it in maths. Okay? Now, initially, I was always a bit slacked off about that, as we say, and saying, you know, you're not meeting the potential, it's not right. But now I've got to a stage of thinking, well, if this model simply turns in a lot of classrooms into nice classroom learning situations where the kids are enjoying their learning, they're probably learning better, then maybe that's not such a bad thing. And occasionally some teacher will take it through to its full potential. But it certainly needs to be more than simply displaying the goals in the room, which I've seen on occasions. I'll put the goals up and use those to reference against them for behaviour. You know, you're not showing this, but they don't actually work towards it. There's 1 or 2 schools in New Zealand have implemented it across all learning areas, mostly elementary schools, as you call them. And that's been driven both times by the principal, who has been the one who knows about the model and has been involved with it, and taken up a principal's position and then driven it. And the success depends really on convincing the students of its worth and their commitment to the principles underpinning the model. Having said that, and I never know how to pronounce this guy's name, Mugala, he did a survey back in 2002 of American teachers, and he found that the vast majority of them were, again, driven by behaviour. They wanted to improve the behaviour of their kids, manage them better, but one of the side products was that just by what they were doing impacted on them, and they became much more humanistic in the way they treated their kids. They couldn't, it was almost an osmosis process where they couldn't do some of these things they were required to make them classes easier to be managed without impacting on the teachers. So while the initial motivation wasn't, I want to work with these kids, teach them personal social responsibility, transfer it into their lives, etc., they were impacted on it. Okay, so future question. I think I've got the time about right. Future questions, and this is the crucial one. It's around transfer, really. If you're looking at the full model, does it actually transfer to other areas of students' lives? Okay, and if it does, what does it look like and how can it be examined? And so from a research perspective, that's what we're starting to look at more and more. Okay, and there's some interesting stuff coming out. One of the things we're looking at the moment, what I've been doing with a guy in Illinois, is there a disjoint between the value attributed to these particular responsibilities, for example, self-control, those sort of things, between what the students think and what the teachers and the adults think? Because if the kids don't value it in any particular way, there's actually 3 stages. If they don't value it, if they don't see that if they do certain things it will happen, and if they don't believe that if it does happen, it's of any value to them, then they won't be interested in transferring. So they have to, and we're researching at the moment, asking them, you know, so do you value self-control? How could you see it being useful? What situations? Because the teachers all think it's brilliant, you know, oh yeah, we want all our kids to be full of self-control, but if the kids don't value it, we don't sell them those there, then it's not going to happen. So the transfer, whole area of transfer is really what's one of the major research areas that's happening at the moment. Not only in this, of course, my wife up there is doing her PhD in transfer, a lot around the police, and whether the learning in the police force that they do can actually transfer into the practice with the officers out in the streets. Okay, a couple of other things, that learning and transfer are so tightly linked. You know, it makes sense that if you don't learn something, you can't transfer it. And transfer, some people talk about it as just preparation for further learning. So how do we maximize the learning so that it can be transferred? Okay, so that's one of the things that we're looking at. Identifying barriers to transfer. So what is it that is acting to stop these kids actually using these things outside? And if we can identify those factors and then try to negate them, that will increase the chance. Okay? The importance of perceived content validity is the idea that do the kids value it? And in their hearts, do they value it? And if they don't, then it's probably not going to work very well. Do we need to work with the kids to develop their personal ability or capacity to transfer to other things? Because if you lack confidence, you're going to be less likely to try it in a new situation. And do we get opportunities to practice? Okay? So there's a whole range around of questions that we're trying to develop and play with as far as the situation at the moment. A question that hasn't been asked very often are the values that we're teaching congruent with their communities of practice? You know, and if a kid leaves our program full of caring and wanting to work with others and show empathy and goes into some of the communities they live in, is that actually a dangerous thing? You know, physically dangerous for them? What do their parents think? Are they living in communities of practice that are actually got quite distinctly different values? And is it our right to teach them? So there's some philosophical stuff going on there as well to think about. I use this expression here, the toxic mutation again. You know, the more that I research, the more variation I saw in the reality of the practice. How do we keep fidelity to the model? What is fidelity to the model? And when do we say, hey, you're not really doing TPSR? It's fine if you're doing something else, but don't say you're doing TPSR unless you're really living the values that we have in there. Okay, and the toxic mutation I like that expression, but it's something to be aware of as well, and I think it's pretty applicable to, And here's some ideas that, again, from Claxton I like, and this is really thoughts for people who are taking a deep breath and thinking they might try and implement the model. Okay, how can you be uncertain without being insecure? Okay, and how do you gain the confidence to work in the fog of uncertainty? And one of the other things that has come out, I'll go back a stage actually. I worked with Don Hallison himself, he is the guru, and we were going into it was a few years ago in Greensboro, and he was going in to take a session, a practical session, and he was as nervous as a kitten. And he said to me, I just don't know what's going to happen. And I thought, bloody hell, you know, this is a guy, this is his model. He's done it for 40 years, and he feels that way. So I felt much better about the fact that that's how I feel. Because when you give up the control, when you give the empowerment, and particularly as a teacher, you start going into new territory, you are uncertain. Always uncertain. You just don't know. And so you have to be able to handle that in some way and gain confidence in that. And I think with experience you do, but it's important at the first stage that you're aware of that. And also he talks about learn to flounder intelligently. And we do flounder. This is not a model that's teacher directed where you know that if you do A, B will probably happen and C will probably happen in D. As soon as you say to the kids, here's the curriculum, you come back to me with what you want to teach or how you want to learn, you don't know what they're coming out with. And you have to take a big jump of faith and accept that. Now, obviously, there's limitations. If they say we want to all just head off and disappear off into the wilderness, then you wouldn't allow that. But you know, you have to have confidence that this uncertainty is going to work its way out. And you do have things go wrong. You know, when in my PhD, we had in that program, the teacher said, "You've got fitness coming up," and the kids were really enthralled at the thought of fitness, as you can imagine. So she gave them some choices, and probably not surprisingly, the girls all decided they wanted to go on a walking program, and the boys all wanted to do weights. All right, which is probably the same in Canada, I would imagine. The girls were then allowed to walk out in the streets around the outside of the school by themselves without supervision, which for fourth form, which is 14, 13-year-old girls, you know, the teacher was really nervous about it. So if we went for 8 weeks, I think, every day the kids would get changed, the boys would go into the gym and have their own programs, and the girls would go and walk around the streets. Oh, and 2 boys who were absolutely irresponsible, couldn't be trusted, they stayed in the gym and the teacher said, right, run 10 lengths, now do 20 press-ups or whatever. So there was the 3 levels working within the one class. The girls were immaculate. Every day they went off and they did their walk, and then they came back in. They had to be back in 15 minutes, I think it was, into the rest of the lesson, and they did that to perfection. It was amazing. Because I was the researcher, I had to check them. So I had to go and hide behind fences and look over and watch to make sure the girls were walking nicely. I kept waiting for the policeman to tap me on the shoulder and sort of say, I'm a researcher, honestly. But I did, you know, and I watched them 3 or 4 times, and they just talked and talked and talked and talked. You know, you could hear them coming from 30, 40 metres away, just full of it, and walking, looking at their watches. We've got to be back on time. And then they came. And then the last week, and I've got it recorded, luckily, we went across early, and the girls had gone to the toilets, left one person in charge of the box, all the bags, and the whole class had gone at interval, so they got an extra 10-minute walk-in. And the teacher then had to decide whether to trust them to leave during interval. And she said, oh, that's fine. And so the kids did that. And so they, because they'd been given the choices, because that's what they wanted to do, that's how it drove. But, you know, really uncertainty. I mean, Megan, who was the teacher, said to me, oh, man, if they break into a car, or they get caught smoking, or they do throw fruit at somebody's house, we're in deep trouble. But we had to take the deep breath, and it worked really well. But it doesn't always work really well. Sometimes you get let down. Okay, and again, the other one was Megan saying that she said to the girls, okay, you can choose what you want to for you. That was cross-country run, which goes down really badly. And 2 of the girls, as a joke, came in pink slippers and said, oh, we're going to run in pink slippers. And she said, fine, off you go. And they looked at her. So they ran in pink slippers, which is, you know, in a school which was quite traditional. They ran straight past the principal, who grabbed them and said, what are you doing? We really gave them a hard time. You're not going out of our school dressed like that. You'll let down our reputation. Put them on a detention. And they came back to Megan and said, can you, basically save us? And she said, no. You chose your responsibility. Take the detentions. I'm not going to have this for you. And they were mortified, but what good learning. Make your choices. Take responsibility for it. And that's really sort of part of the essence. There's a real hard edge to this program. That people sort of think it's often something like out of California in the 1970s, where anything's acceptable and that's okay, you're just, you know, developing. The hard edge is that when you give them choices and they make choices, they have to take responsibility for the results, good, bad, or indifferent. And that's, you know, it's a really good learning situation. And I'm looking at the time, so I'll finish with one last example. And that was in this class, I said about the 2 boys who were absolutely irresponsible, couldn't be trusted. Megan put them on a program where they had to come up with 3 rules, which they signed up to. It took them 2.5 periods because they didn't want to borrow it. But in the end, they agreed that they wouldn't swear, they wouldn't fight, and they wouldn't talk over the teacher. Okay? And the agreement was that if they broke those rules, they would take themselves off to the withdrawal room, which put them into the system, which was not pleasant. And so we signed up on it, and I was watching. And then the next day, this kid came in. He punched the guy. As he walked through the door, he punched him. He then swore, which I won't tell you what he said, but it was as bad as it gets. And then he looked up, and the teacher, and all she did was this. She just went. And he was stuck. And he went like this for about 30 seconds. And then he put his head down. He went and got his bag. And he took himself to the withdrawal room, which was a huge, huge, huge step for this kid. You know, it was really interesting, but he had to take responsibility for his behaviour. Probably the first time. He was a kid who was living with his sister who was a few years older, and the parents had gone and all that stuff. So that was, and he loved physical activity. And so he had to choose to be responsible for his behaviour and not be active that day. So it was a huge thing. And that's the sort of edge that's there. Kia ora and thank you. Kia ora is New Zealand, a bit like your bonjour. which is a greeting or also a thank you. So it's so we say, so when I say kia ora and thank you, that's thank you from New Zealand. The book there, for anyone who really is interested in looking into the model further, obviously Sylvia is here, but that's the sort of classic model. And we have a whakatoki, which is a proverb in New Zealand, Mata hura hura ke rere te manu, which means that without the feathers, the bird can't fly. Okay, and so this model, I think about that because if we don't have our kids develop responsibility, develop those positive socialization skills, then they can't fly. And they will end up in that same situation that they have for many years, you know, and this is, for some kids, this particular model gives them an option, gives them a choice, gives them a chance, gives them a few feathers, and they may or may not fly. Okay? So kia ora, and thank you, and any questions? In English, please. Oh, no, Are the mountains beautiful?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a few questions. I'll start with one concerning the transfer. You said it's the major reason for the program, and obviously it's one of the most important goals. You also said that some of the teachers have a hard time achieving that transfer. Do you have an explanation as to why transfer is often being ignored?
They're not having a hard time with transfer, they ignore it, I think is a better way. And they ignore it because I think teachers around the world want classrooms that are well behaved and well managed, and if they achieve that, then they're really happy. And so depending on the motivation, so often they don't really have that overview of the positive potential. They want to have classes that are nice, and once they're there, that's it. So occasionally you'll meet one that has a really good understanding of the full potential, but they're not really bothered, to be honest, and without being too unfair to them. If it happens, then, you know, one of the results there, they said that it had positive outcomes around the school. They're really happy with that, but it's not a deliberate attempt to achieve it. It's just a nice thing that might happen as well. I think that would be a fair enough for most people. There are occasionally teachers who have the whole model in mind who work hard on transfer. You do need to work hard on transfer right the way through if you want it to. And one example of to do it is that in the reflection time when you say, okay, so who's been showed self-control? In fact, I'll use an exact quote I saw with Paul the other day. He said, "Who lost control today?" And one of the boys said, "I did." And they were playing dodgeball. And Paul said, "I didn't see you lose control." He said, "No, I kept it in my head." "Oh, who lost their temper? Who lost their temper?" "I did." "I didn't see you lose your temper." He said, "No, I kept it in my head." And Paul took the opportunity to say, "Well, that's called self-control." Oh, and it was amazing. A few of the other boys then applauded, so they understood self-control. So the next time Paul said, next session, you know, we talked about self-control when whatever his name is lost his temper and kept it in his head, and they all laughed. Who has done that self-control since we last met, in the last 3 days? You know, who out there at home or in the other classes or whatever, and 2 or 3 kids said, yeah, and someone said, I got angry in maths or whatever it was. And so, you know, that's a way you can start to work that transfer quite easily without having to go too much. But isn't that a lovely saying? I kept it in my head. The lady who was working with us, she went, oh, I teared up, which was nice. Any other questions? As we say, one at a time. Oh.
Thank you for your presentation. My question is about the consequences, sort of with the example you were giving of those 3 boys that stayed in the gym, and that the consequence was that they have to go to the room where they didn't want to go. Well, I'm wondering, at maybe a certain age or a certain level of starting to use TPSR, is it, for example, with those girls that were walking, is there always at the beginning a need of having a consequence? If you don't walk, well, then you will have to sit down for an hour or something, or is just the social responsibilization enough?
Two or three things there, really. We talk about natural consequences. So if you've got a group of girls, and honestly, if you'd heard them talking, it was like a whole group of 14-year-old girls just talking, and they were having a really, really good time. Now, if when I was hanging behind a fence looking over there, I saw one of them smoking, then the natural consequence would have been something very simple, like she would have said, oh, you know, you let us down last week by smoking, so from now on you stay in the gym with these two boys. Or, if smoking would be different, if you'd say mucked around and cut across. If it was an obvious an important rule that was broken, like smoking outside, then the teacher would say, hey, you were smoking, I've sent it through to the principal, you'll be called in tomorrow. There's no you're not excusing their behaviour, you're simply saying, you know, you made the choice to smoke, so you'll go through the system. That makes sense? And so it's whatever the natural result of something will be is what happens. But it's termed within, well, you made the choice to smoke, you made the choice to cut across and sit in the car with your boyfriend, whatever it is. Therefore, and it takes away a lot of those confrontations because the kids know what's going to happen if they break the rules or do something silly. You know, it was like when she just shook her head. That's all she had to do. Normally it was a face-to-face yelling confrontation with this kid, but it was just, and off he went. So yeah, but there has to be, you know, it's around making decisions and the consequences and making choices and having those natural results occur, okay? And whatever they may be. You don't have to say, if you don't walk, you just say, you know, we're trusting you. And you've broken the trust, and so there. And the two boys in that fitness program who spent the whole time running in under the absolute sort of 3-meter control of the teacher, they fully accepted that because they knew their behaviour was so abysmal. And the rest of the class accepted that. They, you know, those kids, well, of course you couldn't send them out for a walk or let them loose in the weight room. Their behaviour was so bad, they recognised that. And that's actually one of the things that happens often is that the kids then start to manipulate, socialise, probably a better word, the misbehaving kids by saying, it's not acceptable, you're ruining it for us. And I was working with a teacher, young teacher, in a really tough New Zealand school. And one of the boys was up, they were trying to do badminton, and he was up the top throwing volleyballs into the middle of the group. And every time they got started, he'd throw volleyballs, and the teacher couldn't catch him because there was two ways to get up on the balcony. And this kid was having just a blast, you know, and he thought it was hilarious. So at the end, when they called him together, he came into the group, and the teacher said, so, has anybody got to say anything? And the class turned on this kid, and they just ripped him. We want to play badminton. You've ruined it for us. What the heck are you doing? And the teacher got so angry, the teacher almost intervened, and I had to say to him, no, just wait, let it run its course. And they did. They vented. And the kid came down expecting to be a sort of hero because he'd done all this stuff, because he thought he was interfering with the teacher. He hadn't clicked that he was interfering with the students, and the students had been given the voice to really tell him that, and they reflect in that discussion time. And he was really unsettled by it. It was great. And then, of course, afterwards, the teacher talked to him and explained how it was, and that was a really big learning for him. But it was a mess. You imagine trying to take a class and volleyball's coming out at 12 o'clock, you know, dong, hitting kids, and so that kid learnt respect. So the next time, hopefully, I can't remember, he would be respectful enough just if he sat in a corner. Okay? Natural consequences. And, you know, we don't want our kids getting into a car, making a decision to get into a car with a drunk when they're 17, and the natural consequences they get wiped out on a bridge, you know. So it's part of that, trying to give them choices early. Okay. Any other questions? Nothing about the All Blacks or rugby?
My next question is about teachers, especially maybe young teachers who are at the beginning of their careers. You said in the beginning that positive and respectful student-staff relationship is very important to implement TPSR. let's say I'm a young teacher and I have a kind of a top-down approach. What would you suggest? Where should I start?
Oh.
You know.
Okay, very good question, and that's the one often teachers ask. When I'm working with teachers, what I tend to do is say, okay, so what you're doing is working reasonably well for you. You don't want to change everything. So choose one class and gradually implement TPSR. So start giving a few choices, start talking, and just work with that. And some will choose their best class and some will choose their worst class because they think, well, it can't get any worse than it is, so we'll see what happens. And slowly concentrate on that one class. And then what almost inevitably happens is that some of the things that work with that class, they start bringing into the other classes anyway. But that gives them confidence. And the idea of you start small and then slowly introduce bits and pieces. So talk about effort and respect and give some choices. It would be a nice little start, and just over a period of time, just gradually battle away. And as they gain their confidence, as they get past that sort of fog of uncertainty, then they start bringing in other things. And often they can't believe how successful they are. Just very quickly, I worked with a science teacher, a lady from India who had moved to New Zealand and was really struggling in a New Zealand high school teaching science. And she just implemented about 3 or 4 things, which gave the students a bit of empowerment. And it was like, because she was trained very much in the traditional Indian way, and it was like, she said, I can't believe it. She actually said, I don't mind waking up in the morning, which was a bit of a worry. So she was at a stage of waking up in the morning going, oh, I've got to go to work. And she said, it's changed enough that I don't mind waking up, which I thought was quite nice, but a bit of a worry on the other hand. Yeah, so start small, one class, and then gradually it'll just spread. And be confident and understand that it'll be uncertainty. There'll always be uncertainty, but then there is anyway, I guess, yeah.
Thank you for your very instructive conference. I appreciate it very much. I read a little bit about this TPSR model. I'm not a specialist in this kind of model, but still I understood that this has been mainly studied and experimented with children and adolescents. Am I right?
Children
Children and adolescents.
Teenagers.
Merci beaucoup. Yeah, teenagers. And what about the adults? Is this model transferable with with older learners? For instance, is it transferable in higher education institutions?
I think Sylvie is the expert on this one, and she's nodding there. And Shona at the back there is saying, yes, think about the police. I think so. I think that it's really interesting. Level 0, which we haven't talked about, is the irresponsibility level, where you're doing all the things like blaming others, etc. And when I work with teachers, we immediately identify that we all do it ourselves. You know, we blame others, don't we? It's not my fault, whatever. And we all have those tendencies. So I believe strongly that, yes, it is. It's a model that, depending on how you do it, can go from 5 years of age right the way through to whatever age. And, you know, Sylvia has written about that a couple of times, working with the teachers. So, yes, I would think that strongly. Sorry, when I was at the school today, I was talking to the lady, the teacher, I don't know her name. Yeah, of the little wee kids. And she knows this. She doesn't know this model, but she teaches like this model. And she said if the kids come at 5 years of age and they say, oh, Mum forgot to put whatever it was in my bag, she said, I say to them, no, you're responsible for making sure it's there. It's not your mother's job. And she said, and so I'm watching, and they come in and they just did what they had to do. You know, they took responsibility. They all knew where they were working. Some were doing maths, some were doing. It was amazing, and that was 5-year-olds. And so too, I think you can get you do. Obviously, you teach it and work in a different way, but you'd be able to work with adults without a problem. And Sylvie, would you agree with that? Oh, yeah. Yeah, I haven't worked with adults much, but Sylvia's work shows that does. Yeah.
Probably I have another one. You mentioned earlier that this model is based on a humanistic approach. But when I looked at this model more carefully, I recognize into this the TPSR model, I recognize also a cognitive psychology approach or model underlying the TPSR. So, is it a reductionist way of seeing the foundations of TPSR by saying that it's only humanistic?
Very good question. The interesting thing about it is that it was developed out of practice. So there was no philosophical, theoretical underpinning for a number of years. And so it's a bit of a catch-up in some ways. Don himself will talk about very much a humanistic approach. By definition, it's a reductionist almost in that there's a certain number of goals that have been identified, and there could be 20 goals or 30 or whatever. And there really is, and I'm sorry, I missed what you said, a sociological or psychological?
Well, it appeared to be quite tightly linked with cognitive psychology, the strategic models.
Sorry, what's the community?
Cognitive
sorry. Well, yeah, there is. And it really is, I think it's almost tied in with a whole range of different theoretical underpinnings, to be honest. You know, it's like it crosses a number of paradigms. And I think that's because it was driven from a very pragmatic man doing what worked initially and not worrying about, you know, not concentrating on any of those other things. In fact, Don talked, you know, people talk about it, the TPSR model, and Don Hallison sort of says, well, you know, it's not really a model, it's just what it is. You know, it's just what it is. And so there is a challenge among academics to actually be able to research around and publish around a model that is just what it is. Okay. In fact, there's a saying here that it's not a model, it's not a pedagogical approach, it's a way of being. It's a way of relating, it's a way of being with students, it's a way of teaching. And I think that's probably, but as academics we try and reduce it all the time. We fight it, but we do try and reduce it down to, you know, a little bit of transfer or, you know, whatever we do, because we need to maintain our tenure and stuff. Oh, another one. I should never have given you the notes yesterday.
My, I guess, last question is a two-parter one, on two different scales, I'd say. So let's say I'm a teacher that's interested in implementing TPSR. I'd assume that it would be much easier if, you know, the whole community, the whole school staff would join in with me rather than, you know, being secluded and doing it on your own. So the first part would be, as a teacher, how do I sell TPSR to my school? And on a bigger scale, you know, as a society, how do you sell TPSR as a model to the government instances? Because you said yourself you're quite lucky in New Zealand to have, you know, the government back up and, you know, state almost word to word some of the TPSR, you know, ways of being. So
the first one was how you sell it in a school?
Yeah,
yep.
As a teacher.
Okay, and then I'll come back to the second one because I would have forgotten it. I don't think unless you've got really strong positional power, you're a principal or something, and you've got some teachers who are really keen on it and know it, then I don't think I'd try and sell it to a school to start with. What I think I'd do is what happens to a lot of our young teachers, the evidence of their practice gets people interested. And so that's, you know, they can say, well, I'm doing it successfully, and therefore they've got confidence. If you come in and you haven't done it yourself, you're not confident if you're a young teacher, then I think it's better just to work on your own classes and then let it spread slowly. It's very difficult to persuade a authoritarian-based teacher that this is a really good idea, particularly if you're a young teacher who's just turned up, you know, wet behind the ears, as they say. And yeah, I think the proof of the reality of your practice was the best way to convince them. So unless you've got some really good support, and I mean, if the school you're working at has got the university support, and so that's really useful. But you need something like that as a young teacher. So I always encourage them, just pick a class, work on it, and then just do your job, and then people will notice, and the kids will notice. Yeah. And the second one was, how do you put it out to society?
Yeah.
And
How do you sell it as a society?
Well, there's two things. One, I was a friend was over from New Zealand, and we went to a presentation by Paul Wright, who's a TPSR person. And afterwards, Peter said to me, "This is just like the Cubs, or the Scouts, Junior Cubs." I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah, we talk about this stuff, and coaches talk about this stuff. And so, you know, it is not the only way. That's one thing. But I think what it is a structure and an explicitness that the Cubs don't have, and those other things don't have. So I think you sell it as a explicit way of character development, positive socialization, with a research base that you can support it, and again, you chip away at it. And when I tried to do this with New Zealand, it's called Sport New Zealand, which is the national body for sport. They didn't want a bar of it, to be honest. Oh, we do that. We always do that. But they don't always do that, and the coaches don't always do that. They say they do, but they don't do it explicitly. So hopefully when I go back, I'll be able to say, well, you know, having a Fulbright, all that stuff, gives you a little bit more credibility, and so maybe I'll be able to persuade them. I don't know. It's not the only answer. It is an answer. And it's not the only answer for some teachers. Some teachers are philosophically, emotionally not able to teach this way. And it would be bad to say you've got to do that, as equally as for telling me I have to be Mr. Authoritarian. You know, I should say, when I was a first young teacher, I was the teacher that the older teachers sent young teachers who were having discipline problems to watch, because I was the traditional physical education, managerial type guy with a whistle, you know, reasonably well renowned for my iron sort of discipline. So for me, doing this has been one huge jump down the other end of the continuum. And so I know the fog of uncertainty really, really well. But I've been persuaded, you know. So yeah, I have some strong reservations around full school implementations, unless you happen to have a bunch of teachers who are philosophically aligned and can do it. And it's tough, you know. Initially it's not an easy thing to do. Does that answer them?
Yeah, totally,
okay.
Absolutely.
Est-ce que d'autres personnes souhaiteraient poser des questions au professeur Gordon? Ou est-ce que nous concluons? Je comprends qu'on conclut. Viens avec moi, Alors, pour remercier notre conférencier de sa présence et de nous avoir sensibilisés au modèle TPSR, le Centre de recherche CRIFPE souhaiterait lui remettre ce cadeau. Here is a gift for you, for your kind presentation. Et pour célébrer aussi sa présence parmi nous, parce que nous n'avons pas l'occasion d'avoir sa visite trop fréquemment. Alors, thank you once again for your conference, and it was a pleasure to hear you about TPSR model.
Merci.
Je voudrais finalement vous remercier pour votre présence durant cette conférence et vous souhaiter une bonne fin de journée. Le professeur Gordon a laissé ses coordonnées ici si jamais vous souhaitez entrer en communication avec lui. Sinon, on a de très dignes représentants du modèle TPSR ici même à l'Université de Sherbrooke. Je vous invite à entrer en communication avec Sylvie et Sarah qui seraient capables de vous orienter si c'est votre besoin. Bonne fin de journée tout le monde.
Sorry, just before you go, I'd just like to thank you both for the opportunity to be here. I would be in Illinois right now if it wasn't for Sylvia's work, so I'm really appreciative of what you've organised. And so thank you very much, everybody at the university. And I'm not sure what you said, but if anyone wants to contact me on the on the email, is that what you said? I hope?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. So thank you very much.